This is talking about having the mind of Christ. And as we think about the mind of Christ in our life and the attitude that we're to have toward other individuals, today I want to talk about and look at a parable that Jesus gave to his disciples in Matthew chapter 13. It is the parable of the wheat and tares, and you think, well, why do we need, or how helpful would a sermon on wheat and tares be? And that in itself helps us to recognize that there are things that Jesus says that sometimes pass over our head, if not oftentimes. So I'd like, first of all, to read this parable. It is one of several parables, evidently, that he gave on the same day in a sermon or in a conversation, as you might look at, that he was giving. So Jesus told them this parable here, beginning in verse 24 of Matthew 13. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. And when the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servant came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and to pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you're pulling the weeds, you may root up the wheat with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters first to collect the weeds, and then in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring them into my barn." So that's a simple thing. Well, it's not quite as simple as we might think. And it's not simple because of several things. One, Jesus gave this parable. Number two, it was important enough that it was written in the Bible and preserved for us. Number three, I think after the fact, it made an impact on the disciples that they didn't understand immediately. So the story of every farmer or every gardener can relate to the fact that there are things that are hidden in the garden. There are problems that we have, things that don't meet our eye, and all of us have had to deal with weeds. Jim and I attempted to go get some compost yesterday. I say attempted because it didn't work out exactly as I had planned. But one of the purposes of that is use the compost not only to fertilize, but to keep weeds down in my garden, or the community garden that I am working with. So when we look at that, we all have to deal with it. Back where I came from, the weed of choice was not marijuana, though it did grow wild back there. And we were kind of unaware. We called it loco weed and the like, but you could go get it any time. Not that I have, and because I haven't. But the weed of choice was ragweed and thistles is what we had back there. Now, they're easy to recognize as being weeds. They don't look like green beans. They don't look like corn and the like. But the weed that we're talking about here in this particular parable that Jesus is given to us, they were called tares. And they were weeds that would come up. They were semi-poisonous weeds that came up. And when we look at the parables of Jesus, there are some things as we start this that I want us to be aware of. Especially the fact that Jesus' parables are the most famous and best known stories in the world. Because you can begin to quote a parable and people, they may not be able to remember exactly where it came from, but they're familiar with it. And Jesus is especially allowing his audience to easily relate to a common background of the story. So when I talk about weeds and I talk about crops, in this case weeds and tares, most of us can identify this because every farmer knows about crops and knows about weeds. And when we think about crops, we think about the good seed and weed as the bad seed. Now there's a saying that goes, this year's seed is 7 years of weeds, because you can plow. There were laws, actually there were Roman laws that were quite punishable, crimes, if you planted in somebody's garden. There was some guy in India who, as a part of vengeance, planted something, and the guy could never get rid of it. It's kind of like if you were to plant bamboo in somebody's yard. When it starts sprouting, or in the south, it's kudzu. Kudzu just keeps coming and coming and growing and growing and growing. And so they would do that. So one might come away from Jesus' parable or presentation thinking, I get it, but what difference does it make in my life? And I'm going to suggest this is the approach or the attitude that the disciples themselves had. Hey, we can take care of this weed problem. A little Roundup will take care of it. And I say that because we recognize there in Roundup now is supposedly causes cancer, and there are all kinds of. It's like the answer to their problem isn't the answer that Jesus is getting at. And then we can hear only the literal interpretation, missing Jesus' meaning and purpose. So the wheat and tare parable is quite likely, when Jesus is giving this parable, there's a good chance that his audiences, because he's sitting on the lake and the like, that his audiences could probably look out behind them or around them and see fields. There's a good chance that they may well have walked through those fields and that they would have seen wheat and weeds growing at that time. And so they would be very aware of this. Now, the parable defined as an early story, a parable is defined as an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Now, this is what Jesus says in this particular parable. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seeds in a field, but while everyone is sleeping. So this has a connection to a heavenly meaning. Therefore, it is important. It has a universal appeal to an ordinary man with an ordinary mind. So, and then the way that we think in our human mind is by these ordinary stories, by these ordinary parables. We have flashes, we have pictures in our own mind, and we're able to kind of connect as a result of that. Now, I want to say this because we're talking about Jesus talking to the people of his day. I do want to make a little side note. The side note being about the basic difference between a Greek and a Jewish mind. So he's talking to basically a Jewish congregation. Now, the thing is about Greeks, and I know a few Greeks, is that they love an argument for the sake of an argument, and they don't have to reach a conclusion. That would drive me nuts, and it does drive me nuts. Now, I'm not saying that I'm Jewish, but I'm just saying that kind of reason, just argue and feel like, oh man, we just had a great debate. Wasn't that a lot of fun? I'm thinking, no. Why do we spend all this time debating things? And this is kind of like sometimes when we have an attitude towards even theology. People will debate. If God is so all powerful and the like, can he make a rock or something that's bigger than him and he's not able to lift? And then we can have this argument. Or the argument, if nobody's in the forest and a tree falls, Is there any sound? Does it make any sound? These kind of ridiculous kind of arguments. On the other hand, the Jewish mind tends to want to reach and find a conclusion, and then upon that conclusion, take action.
The world today is a challenging environment for Christian believers and followers of Jesus Christ. Looking for answers? Grace Communion International local churches in Fairfield, Santa Rosa, and Modesto offers a comforting environment for Christians in search of spiritual growth and development. Contact our local ministry. Attend our local GCI churches at the times listed on your screen.